Hi, I'm Will Johnson, also known as Power Nerd Insights. I work as a senior power platform specialist for Vantage 365, and I'd like to welcome you to this Power Nerd presentation. Okay, so welcome everyone to this Friday's learning session. My name's Will Johnson, also known as Power Nerd Insights. I have been a senior power platform specialist for about 4 years now, currently working with Vantage 365 in the UK. And I generally host these sessions to kind of provide a bit of teaching and a bit of learning. And we're actually continuing our multi-part series this week, coming up to the final few sessions. So this session we are going to be covering how we apply business logic in Dataverse. More specifically, we're going to be focusing on what our options are when it comes to that business logic and investigating how we do it. So as usual, we do have an agenda for the session today. So we have the introduction. That's where we are now. Hi. Uh, Today's session is relatively light. We're going to be digging more into the technical side of it in terms of we're actually going to be looking at a power platform and more specifically the Power Apps area in terms of how we deal with business rules and business process flows and applying that business logic. And then we do have our discussion session at the end. So that is an opportunity for us all to, as a community, come together, have that discussion, provide our insights and kind of different viewpoints of what we've seen and what we've dealt with, and also ask questions because we are all here to learn. But before we get into the content, we do have our usual rules of engagement. So I only have one kind of major rule with these sessions, and that is that there is no such thing as a stupid question. I firmly believe in this. I really do ask you to try and test that. I have a 4-year-old daughter. She asks me different questions every day. We've yet to find a stupid question, which is always positive. But we're all here to learn, and so if you've got a question on your mind, please do ask it. We want to be able to answer those questions to help you all out. So, with that being said, we are going to move into the actual core of kind of the session today. Obviously, we are focusing at applying business logic in Dataverse and the options that we have available to us. So the first thing we need to understand is what are your options when it comes to applying business logic in Dataverse? Well, really from a perspective of the PL-200, the kind of functional consultant piece, because that is our focus today, the two things you need to know about are business rules and business process flows. Those are our options when it comes to applying that business logic. And actually, each one of these serves a slightly different purpose. Business rules deal with a single table, whereas business process flows deal with guiding a user through multiple steps in a process and can span multiple tables. And we'll be looking a bit more about what those are, how to set them up. So today we'll be covering for both of these, what each one is, what their general use cases are, how we create them, and also how we edit them. Because what we're used to when it comes to things like Canvas apps or Power Automate flows is we hit the edit button and all of a sudden it works fine. There's a one little hitch that comes into place for things like business rules and business process flows. It's worthwhile knowing that can sometimes get you caught up when you're working with them. So like I said, your options for applying business logic, business rules, and business process flows. That's what you need to know for the PL-200, that functional consultant piece. So we're actually going to cover business rules first. So what are business rules? Well, put simply, business rules are logic and validation that's declarative, very much in a similar sense to kind of our declarative languages when we look at PowerFX. And it is essentially that validation and logic is associated with a single Dataverse table. So I mentioned that at the start, that this sits itself at the table level that can be run either client side when working within a model driven app form and or server side when a row is created or updated. Now, what does that client side and server side mean? This is important to note. So when the rule is run client side, it means that the rule is running essentially immediately, where within a model driven app, when a user changes a field on a model driven app form. So that's what client side means in this context. Server side means when the row is saved or the row is created, uh, and the business rule that we set up, the logic for it runs before things like the save action complete. So we mentioned in a previous session about low code plugins and being able to define the operation step within a low code plugin. Business rules, at least from a server side perspective, happen pre-operation. So this means that if you have a business rule, and we'll see how we configure these and create these in a moment, and this will make a bit more sense. When we're looking at a server-side business rule, essentially what this is the business rule will occur before the save action completes. When a user hits the save button, the business rule will run first, check what it needs to check, and then it might spit out an error, or it might say yes, this record's fine, right? So it can actually stop the save from actually occurring. But that's all well and good in terms of understanding what they're used for, in terms of that logic and validation. In terms of what they are, we now need to look at what use case there are. So business rules are exceptionally valuable for data validation. Using them, you can do a lot of things. You can set the value in a specific column. You can change a field's requirement level. For example, set a field as required based upon the value of another field while the user's actually in the form and have it move dynamically. You can validate a record being created and show error messages if it doesn't match certain formula or certain patterns. You can prompt the user with specific recommendations while they're working in a form. So, for instance, if they answer a specific question one way, or put text in a box in a certain text in a box, you could turn around and put a recommendation against another field and say, hey, maybe you should fill this in with this. Um, Given kind of all these things that we can do with it, the most common use cases business rules are used for is that data validation piece prior to a record being submitted, making sure that that record that's being created matches what we expect and doesn't have any data issues. The other most common use case is changing the requirement of a field based on the value in another field while the user's filling the form. So in cases whereby, we have a table that has a few columns, but only one or two of the columns might be used for, let's say, a drop down on a choice list, we can change that kind of field requirement level from the business required maybe down or maybe up. And then the other thing you could do is automatically populating fields on the form based on values in another field. So we could turn around and say when a user changes a specific drop down or enters text, hey, change this field over here, make it this value, so that they don't then have to worry about that. So as we can see from that, a lot of that kind of use case is data validation and ensuring that we're getting kind of the right fields filled. We're providing users recommendations as they might need them, but also kind of manipulating how a model-driven app form might look. And we're actually going to have an example of this today, because when we look at how we create them, I'm going to walk you through how you do each of those things. So that is the next bit. How do we create them? Well, this is very simple. What we do is we come into, I always start from a solution. So you can see here, I've got a help desk ticketing system solution that I've worked on previously. I have a number of tables that I can access, and I'm just going to choose a table. Now, when we went through kind of the Dataverse overview earlier in these multi-part sessions, we looked at what our options were over here, and you can see under the customization section, we have business rules. So to be able to create a business rule, we come to the table we want and we select the business rules. And then we hit new business rule. And once you hit new business rule, you get a nice little extra tab over here and you get greeted with the business rule editor. Now it's worthwhile noting that every business rule starts with a condition. Okay, so that's over here. This essentially is a condition that you have to set up to be able to have your business rule run. So you can see here, I've got a source of either entity. I can choose a field specific. So let's say for the case of this, let's say I want the category order is equal to 3. Okay, I apply that condition. And then there we go. What's going to happen is when this business rule gets triggered, um, it's going to check for this condition. Does the category order equal 3? And then it's going to do a lot of things. Once we've configured that condition, there is another key thing that we have to note, and it's slightly hidden away. Up in this top right corner over here, we have this thing called scope. Now, this is really, really important, and it's something very, very much we should always be aware of. After we've configured our condition, the very next thing we should do is set your scope. Now, when you go into that scope, you have three options. You have the entity option, which is the default. Now, we could see in terms of my business rule, that's set to entity already. Now, when I press down on that, I've got entity, all forms, and then the name of my main form. This table doesn't have any other main forms, it's just got the information form, but if there were other main forms in this table, they would appear here beneath this. But what we need to know is that essentially you've got three options that have an impact. You've got entity. What does entity mean? Well, choosing the entity scope for your business rule means that this rule will run whenever a record is edited using a model-driven app form or created, no matter if it's being interacted with in a model-driven app or being created in a Canvas app or being created by a Power Automate flow. If you choose the entity scope, no matter what happens, whatever way a record is created or edited, this business rule will run. So you need to make sure that obviously when you're choosing the entity scope that this is something that has to happen at all times. Um, this is obviously, like I said, the default. And the reason why I put this down as a key thing to note around these scopes is because if you, for instance, say, oh, I want you to change the field visibility in a business rule, that field visibility action that we'll see a little bit later is specific to a model-driven app form. If you put that in an empty scope and then try to create a record with, let's say, a Canvas app, that business rule is going to run and you might run into some issues in terms of that action specifically. The next scope option that we had on our dropdown was the all forms option. Now, what that means is if you choose that option, this business rule that you're configuring here, the logic that you create will essentially run whenever a record in that table is being edited or created using a form. Be that in a model-driven app or using a form kind of from the actual table entry, which obviously we tend not to do. We tend to do it through a model-driven app. But it's worthwhile noting that if you scope it to this, it doesn't matter what form a user is using. It could be the main form, it could be a quick create form. The business rule will try to run. Okay. And then the kind of third-ish option, I call it a third-ish option because obviously I mentioned that I've only got one main form, but you can actually select a specific form for this business rule to apply to. So if I were to select this information form, what that means is when we look at that specific form, that main form that I've selected there, that means that rules set up with that scope will only trigger when a record is being edited or created using the specific form selected. So it's a very quick way to narrow it down and say, hey, I only want this business rule to run on this specific information form. It's worthwhile noting that that business rule selection only allows you to select main forms, not things like quick create forms or card view forms. But again, cannot stress this enough. When you're creating these items, first thing is to configure your condition and make sure you hit that apply button. And then the second thing is always make sure you set your scope. Okay, very, very important that that be done. Once you've actually selected your scope, you can obviously then have to add your actions. You have to tell the system what you want to do. But how do we do that? Obviously, when I clicked on this condition, it moved me over to the properties of the condition. We've actually got this components tab here. Now, there's a limited number of actions you can do within a business rule. You can actually see them all here on the screen. So to control how your business rule operates and change the flow and structure of it, we only have one option. We have the condition. So I can sit here, add in a new condition, and I could say, hey, I'm going to set this so that ticket category name equals ticket category test. And hit apply. So what's going to happen is in the event of the business rule triggering where I've got these two conditions, it's going to check this condition first and it's going to say, hey, is this true or false? If it's true, it's going to perform the actions that I configure here. If it's false, it's then going to check this condition. So it behaves very much in a way of a nested if. It it doesn't have the option in terms of kind of not in terms of running like a switch. It'll just check one condition after the other until it finds one that's true and then move over. You do have the option as well to add additional bits in terms of set your rule logic. Once you define a condition and you define rules against it, you can choose and or and kind of configure your condition that way. They're relatively simple. We put our condition in, we configure our fields here, and then it tests whether it's true or false. This is just to change the flow. We now need to actually give it some actions to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to components and I'm going to go through essentially what each action does and how it might be used. So the very first one, recommendation. If I drag this over here, you can see here, recommendation comes in. What does recommendation actually do? So recommendation allows you to select a field and provide a recommendation title and details which will show up against the field that you have selected when the business rule runs. So in the case of this, I can set here and go new recommendation, and I'm going to say, hey, category color, your recommendation title should be, uh, and I'm going to say, just because it's the only one I tend to remember, a hex color. I apply on that. Now, the recommendation is slightly odd. It's one of the very few actions that you have to click the details button down and you get this new action here. You have to define an action in the recommendation for it to be able to save itself and validate. So if I don't configure this, this is an additional bit of information. You can actually validate whether your rule is going to be able to save or not. If I choose validate, it's going to say, hey, we found 3 errors in the process. Now, what it's found when it comes to the recommendation is you haven't set this action here, and you haven't added any actions for this condition. So come in here, select this, and I'm going to say category color and apply there. And we are actually going to get to see some of these actions in play once we set this up and get it saved properly and created. So that's the recommendation action. When we look at how it works, essentially, like I said, just puts that recommendation title and the value in there as a recommendation to the user, providing that kind of bit of feedback that they might need to prompt them to put something in. The lock unlock action. Uh, this is very much self-explanatory. You can choose whether a field is locked or unlocked on your form when you're using this. So this impacts forms specifically. Now, what does locked or unlocked mean? It basically means is that field editable or not? Very, very simple. All we do is we choose the kind of field that we want to lock. So you can see there, hit that, and off we go. That's going to lock the owner if the category order is not 3, but the ticket category name is equal to ticket category test. We have the show error message. Again, very self-explanatory. We add it on. And as you can see, while I'm doing this, this is very much a drag and drop interface. It's very much low code, well, no code really, in that similar to how we do a little bit in Canvas apps, we drag and drop our kind of actions or our controls on there to do what we need to do, and then configure the properties of them. Now, error message allows you to show an error message against um, a specific field. So again, we select our field that we want to display the error message against. For the case of this, I'm going to choose category order, and then you provide a value for the error message to show. And again, so you'll notice that every time I configure an action, I'm making sure I hit the apply button. If you try to configure an action and then click away from it into another action or add another action without hitting that apply, your changes are not saved. You have to start doing them all over again. So it's good habit as well to, whenever you finish doing something, always hit the apply button. The set field value kind of action there does what it says on the tin. It allows us to set the value of a field. So in the case of ticket category test, I want to set category description to this is a test category. Apply that, and what will happen is in the case that this condition is false and this condition is true, that's going to set our category description to this as a test category. Setting default value, again, very similar to the set field value. We choose a field. I'm going to say it's, let's go for category order, and I'm going to choose the default value as 4. What it's going to do is that's going to set the default value of that field to 4. Very self-explanatory. Step is required. So this is one of the most common ones we see when it comes to business rules. Okay, this is how we set whether a field is going to be required or not. So I could change here. I could choose the field. I'm going to say external link is not business required. Actually, for the case of the category order being 3, I'm going to set this as business required. Hit apply. Very simple. Means that we can change the requirement of fields on the form on the fly. And then set visibility. Again, just allows you to change what fields are visible on the form as we go. So I'm going to choose here that the category name is not visible. So you've configured your business rule here. We've got our conditions. We've adjusted how the flow works. We know what the actions are. We've got it all set up. So what do we need to do now? Well, I'm going to make sure I configure my scope correctly for the demo of this. I now need to save it. When you hit save, what will happen is the validation that we did over here will automatically run. It'll then process. Now, unlike where we have in the Power Automate, where we had in the old designer, we had the save button, it just saved and did it. There is a slightly different process for business rules. We have to save it and then we have to activate it. If you do not activate your business rule, what's going to happen is it's essentially just not going to run. It'll be created, it'll be present there, but it will not run at all. You will get a pop-up saying you want to activate it. You press activate, and there we go. That's now been created. That's there, and this actually kind of slightly leads us on to the how to edit option as well. So I mentioned that there is a process to editing these that's slightly different. We're used to with Power Automate and Canvas apps being able to just hit the edit icon and it'll take us to it. That's not the case for business rules, and we'll see that's also not the case for business process flows. When you come into the actual business rule to edit it, you go through that business rules bit like we did to create it. We select the rule that we've created that we want to edit in that list, and we get greeted with this. We cannot edit anything until we deactivate the rule. So it's worthwhile noting that you have to deactivate the rule to be able to edit it. If I hit deactivate, what that means is for the duration that I'm editing this business rule, that business rule will not run on that kind of entity. So now I can start to add things in and do things as we go. But again, once you're done, make sure you save and then make sure you hit activate again. So we've actually created our business rule here. It's working, it's doing what it needs to do. So we want to see this in action. So how do we see that? Well, I obviously set this to be at entity level. So there we go. We can see the new business rule that I've created is in there. We can see its status is on. We can see its scope to the table and that it is customizable. So when we come into our form here, I'm just going to quickly add some fields to the information form. So that business rule has been configured. I've got all my form fields on there. We can see that only ticket category name is business required at the moment. So we should start to see some of the form changes when we run through this. There we go. So we tested test ticket category and we said ticket category order 3. So right there we can see, hey, I've got a recommendation against category color. And there's my recommendation. So that's my recommendation in the business rule running. I can hit apply and great, it's dropped it in. We can see that we've got an error message against category order. Hey, category order, this category order is already present. Great, I'm going to set that to 4. So we can see that running live in the form as we go. Makes things a lot easier. But that is business rules. That's how we create them, how we edit them, how we kind of get them to run, and what they look like as well. So just to summarize, obviously you can see there that I'm able to adjust kind of how the form runs, how it works. I'm able to validate specific data, put error messages up, and kind of get that created. Key points to take away from that are kind of the ability to do that data validation, but also what each of the scopes do, and how they might impact where and how your business logic that's applied via business rules is implemented. These business rules are really, really powerful for that data validation when they're applied to a table. And they are kind of set up to only work on a single table. which is really very useful. It means that we can very quickly kind of tie that together and get that working and running. Now, what happens if we have a multi-step process that spans multiple tables and business rules isn't going to cut it because it only applies to a single table, not multiple? Well, that's when we get into business process flows. So, what are business process flows? Well, very simply, they're a way to create a guided, stage-based path that help users complete kind of multi-step business tasks in a model-driven app that might either exist in a single table or might exist across multiple tables. When you create them, they essentially sit on top of one or more Dataverse tables. You define a sequence of stages and steps and actions that you want to occur in that process, and they also enforce the order in which the users enter the required information. When they run client side within an app, showing a kind of visual breadcrumb, which we'll get to see, of stages and locking out any the user from progressing to any later stages until the current one that they're in is complete. So they really do work for kind of hand holding a user through entering data, creating records, and doing what they need to do. So, what are our use cases? Well, they are exceptionally valuable for, like I said, standardizing those multi-step processes. So, for instance, when we're looking at IT service case resolutions, right? We know that they go through different steps. They go through kind of your investigation step, your resolution step, your close down step, right? You can actually create a business process flow to walk someone through that process and fill in the information that they need to at each stage. It makes sure that every user follows the same path and captures the same data, right? So that they're all doing what they should be. The other kind of common use case is to try and enforce an element of what I would term data completeness. By making stages and certain steps required, which we'll see when we look at how to create them, we're going to prevent users from being able to skip critical information. They can't progress to the next stage until they complete the information that I've said they need to complete, right? The other use case is where you've got branching scenarios. So you might have it, and again, we'll see when we get to the creating it, you might have it so that if they enter a specific field at one stage or specific bit of information at one stage, it then turns around and goes, well, actually, you're not following this pathway anymore. You're going to go down this one instead. So we have that branching logic there. And then the other thing as well is one of the common things that business process flows are implemented for is to be able to improve kind of user adoption training, because you're providing on-screen guidance and stage names that can mirror a business's terminology, right? So you can make it very easy for users to follow through a process that they're used to that's now being digitalized or automated. So those are our common use cases. Looking at them in terms of making it clear and guiding users through multi-stage processes, making sure we get that data completeness and improving that user adoption training. But how do we actually create them? Well, very similar to our business rules. We come into a solution, and you can see here I've got one that I've already run up before, but we'll create a new one. So you choose new, you go to automation, go to process, and go to business process flow. This is where they're created. You choose a display name, and as always, it gives it a logical name off the bottom, which you can edit. And then you choose a host table. So this is really important that you get this right, because this is where this is the table where your business process flow will start. If you choose a kind of a table later on in the process that you're looking to kind of outline to the users, it's going to be very difficult to set this back up. You're going to have to reset it. Now, in the case of the demo that I'm going to show today, I'm going to choose the ticket categories table, because I want to be able to guide my IT users through the process of setting up a brand new category, the ticket types that fall underneath that, and the questions that are going to be asked at each ticket type. So there we go, HTS ticket categories, which you can see is in my solution here. and then hit create. So we wait for that to go through. And you can see we get a very similar kind of setup and user interface as to what we got for the business rules. In that we have the kind of section on the right, which includes our actions and our bits to change the flow. We have a properties tab for when we select things and a few other bits. Now, when we look at this, as you first come in, you will always have your first stage here. There is always at least one stage, and that is initially configured there. So once we've got that there, we make sure we give our flow a kind of a name, which we've done. Before adding steps, it's always worthwhile just thinking about the major phases of your process. A lot of the time, kind of a good process flow will have around 3 to 6 stages. When you get to more than 6 stages, it becomes very unwieldy in terms of guiding the user through these. So once we've thought about that, we need to configure our stages first. And this is what I would always recommend is configure your stages first. When we look at this, I've got a stage here. I'm going to make sure I name this stage. So this is create ticket category. Okay. The entity for this is that primary entity that we've selected. It is that ticket categories bit. Now, you do have a section around kind of categories. You can assign a category to this. This does change how it's displayed slightly, but a lot of time I have a tendency to leave that blank. These are very much a case of kind of the categories are very similar to things like lead development and kind of a business generation perspective. So once I've given my stage a name, great, that's my first stage there. I then need to configure my future stages. Well, actually, I'm going to put in another stage here. Now, obviously, I said that this is a sequential process. When it looks at business process flows, we're looking at guiding the user through that process. Well, actually, once a user has created the ticket category and done what they need to do, they're then going to have to define the ticket types. So I'm going to change the entity of this stage to be the ticket types, and I'm going to put create ticket type and hit apply. And then after that, actually, I need a third stage. So I'm going to drop this in here, and this one is going to cover the ticket type questions. And what that means is that essentially for the case of this, hey, we've created a ticket type. I now need you to create questions that go against that ticket type. Right, great. I've mapped out my stages, not a problem. But I haven't yet defined the actions that the user is supposed to take. So how do we do that? Well, we have our little details bit here, and you can see that what happens is we have two bits in there. We have steps and triggered processes. A lot of the time, what we are working with is steps. Now, this one that you can see in terms of each of these always gets given a data step. These data steps are part of the components you can see here, where we've got composition. We have data steps, workflows, action steps, and flow steps, and we'll kind of cover each one. But the most important one for our purposes today is the data step. What does the data step do? Well, using a data step, we can obviously give it a step name. So give ticket category name. I'm going to select a data field. Well, actually, we're creating a ticket category here. They have to have the name. I'm going to make that step required, and I'm going to put it as sequence 1. I'm going to hit apply. Great. Now what will happen is in this business process flow, when they come into the ticket category table, they're going to start and it's going to say, hey, you have to be able to progress to the next stage, you have to give this ticket category a name. And it's going to make that kind of a mandatory field. I can add in another data step. So it's as simple as, again, drag and drop across. And this one's going to be, let's say, let's go for category description. And this is going to be required as well. And I'm going to call this, put this as sequence 2. Now the sequencing matters. Essentially, that's going to change how your business process flow looks. If I were to change this to 1, essentially it's going to, we can see it a little bit later once we actually finish this, but it'll change how the data steps and the inputs appear when we look at the business process flow kind of user interaction. So great, I've configured my two kind of data steps there. I only wanted a category name and a category description. But actually, let's say I wanted to be able to trigger a classic workflow. Very simply, you just drag that across and drop it into triggered processes. Now, this is fallen under triggered processes. You can see here we set a display name. Normally, that would allow us to enter in. Now, it doesn't. Now, this is where we get into some of the automation bits that come off the back of business process flows. When you're looking at workflows, you can actually trigger workflows on coming into a stage for a business process flow or on leaving a stage for the business process flow. Now I'm going to choose stage entry here, and I'm going to have a look at workflows. It doesn't look as if I have any, but if I had a classic workflow configured, I could add it here, and then on the entry to the stage on the business process flow starting, this workflow would then be triggered and it would do what I need it to do. We then have action steps. Looks like my categories dropped out. So action steps go in the steps section. The only item here that goes under the triggered processes is workflows. You can see there, I can change the sequence again. I can set it to 1, or I can set it to 3. I can name the step. And then it's talking about executing a process. So again, I don't have any processes, but you drop that in. This is where we have to define processes to match kind of the stage entity. So these are processes that run against the ticket categories table. I don't have any currently, so therefore the action step is blank, but you can execute those processes using the action step. And then we have my personal favorite. While it is marked as preview, it has been around for a while. The ability to run flows on a specific stage. So you can see here, again, it falls under the steps section. We choose our sequence, we select the flow, and I can turn around and say, hey, I want you to run, let's say, hit apply. And what's going to happen is that's going to basically appear as an option to run that flow to the user. Once we've configured all our data steps, bear with me 2 moments. So we've now configured our 3 stages. We've put our data steps in. We can make it a lot more complex than what it is, but for the purpose of today, we'll just keep it as that. We've configured what we need to do. We've got the logic in there. We now need to save the flow. Obviously, it goes through the validation. And then, just like with business rules, we hit activate. Make sure you hit activate again. Okay, while that's activating, what I will cover, you see up here in the top right, edit security rules. This is something worthwhile noting for now. You can actually define which security rules are allowed to or will be able to run this business process flow from there. So you can actually turn around and say, well, actually, for this business process flow, I only want a specific admin role to have to use it, right? Otherwise, everybody ends up using it. It looks as if activating a business process flow has killed my system. Not a problem. Let's open up this one that I prepared earlier, just in case. Joys of live demonstration. So here's one I've prepared earlier. We've only got 2 stages, but we've got a few things in there, right? And activate, done that. I'll just very quickly run up a model-driven app based off of this. So there we go. That's now activated over this side. While waiting for the model-driven app to spin up, you do have the option as well to edit these ones. If you try to edit it without deactivating it, it's going to fail. So again, just like with business rules, make sure you deactivate the business process flow before you try to edit it, and then kind of go from there when you're editing. Right. So I'm just going to quickly add in a HTS ticket categories, ticket types, ticket type questions. Okay. So we're about to see a business process flow and what it looks like now that we've configured our kind of our form and everything else. So I go in to create a new ticket category here. I've got nothing in there at the moment. And you can see that we have this nice little breadcrumb up here. And right now that ticket types category is locked out. I can't do anything with it. Okay, so if I click on this item here, it's going to say, hey, I need from you the ticket category name, the category description, and the category order. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to progress to the next category, to the next stage. Great. All done. Hit save. And then right here, you can see I'm now able to hit next stage, progress that on. So I'm going to create a new ticket type. And then over here, it's going to say, hey, we need a ticket type name and a ticket category. So as you can see, very quickly guiding users through that process there. In terms of the sequencing, obviously I mentioned about the fact that if you change the sequencing, that changes how these appear. But once a user gets to the end of the process, they can hit finish. And there we go. Job done. I've now guided my user through that process and created what I need. So, with all that being said, when it comes to creating business process flows, it's a little bit more involved because we have the ability to add in flow steps and workflows and other bits. We have a bit more automation, but what we need to understand really from the PL-200 perspective is how to create them, what the actions do in terms of how we define data steps, but also what our common use cases are in terms of guiding users through multi-step processes and implementing data completeness. But alongside that, making it so that we can make the process a lot easier for our users. So that is today's session. Hope you found it useful in terms of business rules and business process flows, and those are our options for applying logic in Dataverse. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful and got to learn something new, and I'll see you in the next one.